January 17, 2024, Mohe, Heilongjiang Province, 50 or Fernagangs. That morning the modern houses were too quiet. The Jiawei family did what everyone else did in winter. Heater on, windows sealed, complete trust in the electrical grid. That was how life was lived in what was known as the North Pole of China. Constant comfort, warm air circulating, until the power went out. First came the silence of the fan. Then, still air. 3 hours later, the cold was already accumulating on the walls. No one there built those houses to retain heat. They built it to depend on him. The curious thing is that centuries earlier, in that same region, a man named Liang Shen was doing the exact opposite. While everyone today is trying to warm the air, he heated the stone. And when winter put these two ideas to the test, only one of them remained habitable. But to understand why, we need to go back to the moment when cold weather stopped being just a climate and became a threat. Cold weather in northern China is not an isolated event. It's a presence. In Mohe, doors freeze in their frames. Motors refuse to start. Children learn early on that you don't touch metal with your bare hands. The Jiawei family always believed they were prepared. Modern insulation, central heating, double glazing. Everything seemed solid, but it depended on something invisible. When the power went out that week in January, the warm air began to dissipate. Slowly at first, then too quickly. The insulation kept the air trapped, but not the heat, and the air grew colder by the minute. The walls had no plaster, the floor held nothing. The entire house was too light to fight against, 51 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, centuries earlier, during the early winters of the Little Ice Age, a northern farmer named Liang Shen observed something different. The neighbors burned wood all day long trying to heat the whole house. They consumed piles of firewood. Even so, they woke up with ice in their bowls of water. Liang was doing something else. He spent weeks shaping bricks, compacting earth, building a raised platform in the corner of the house. They laughed at him. "Are you going to sleep on mud? This won't heat anything up." He didn't answer. He built internal tunnels. He connected the kitchen stove to the platform base. On the first morning, he lit the fire. The smoke didn't rise straight up the chimney. It slowly drifted through the channels beneath the brick. When it came out, it no longer burned my eyes. The heat remained. Hours later, while the air in the room was freezing, the surface remained warm. Liang did not try to warm the space. It heated the exact spot where the body was resting. The others continued spreading fire through the air. He focused his energy on the mass. But Kang was only the beginning, because Liang realized something bigger. If the earth already maintains a stable temperature, why not live inside it? And it was at that moment that winter ceased to be just about the weather. It became a logic test. 14th century, northern China. Winters were no longer what they used to be. The cold arrived early. It stayed late. Harvests were dwindling. Firewood was becoming more valuable than rice. Most families reacted the same way. More fire, more bonfires lit, more wood stacked, more smoke escaping through the cracks. It seemed logical. The bigger the flame, the more heat. But Liang Shen began to notice something that didn't add up. The longer they burned, the faster the house cooled down when the fire died down. It was like filling a leaky bag. He watched in silence. He wasn't the strongest man in the village. He wasn't the most respected. He was known for working too slowly. He overthinks, they said. That winter, while the others were storing firewood, Liang began to dig, not to expand the house, but to sink it. At first it was just a slight depression in the ground. Then it was deepened. The sides were reinforced with compacted earth. Arches were shaped. They laughed again. "Are you going to live like a rat? Burying your own house is giving up." He didn't argue. "I knew something simple. Several meters below the surface, the earth does not freeze like the air. The earth changes slowly. While the wind cuts through the skin, the ground remains stable." Liang didn't want to win the winter. "I wanted to reduce the gap between inside and outside." Kang was already warming up his body. Now he wanted the walls to help. When the first excavated room was finished, it seemed too small, too dark, too low. But when the cold weather arrived in full force, something changed. Outside, the wind scratched at the wooden structures. Inside the cavity, the air remained surprisingly neutral. Not hot, but not deadly. The neighbors started noticing something strange. The water inside Liang's house did not freeze overnight. His, yes, some said, but less so. And less, that winter, meant surviving. Still, He wasn't safe, because the cold of that season was unusual. He was persistent, and persistence wears you down. The firewood was dwindling, the food too, and that's when the first mistake appeared. Liang noticed that Kang's tunnels were accumulating soot. The smoke flow decreased. If it became clogged, the heat wouldn't circulate, and worse, it could go back inside the house. He dismantled part of the structure in the middle of winter to clean the canals. The village watched. Now it's going to freeze. Perhaps it was true, because dismantling the only source of stored heat during the worst of the cold seemed unwise. But he knew that keeping something partially functional was more dangerous than interrupting and fixing it. He worked with cracked hands, visible breathing inside one's own home. When the fire reignited, the smoke circulated cleanly again, and the heat lasted longer than before. It was the first small, silent victory, but winter had not yet shown its worst, because a few weeks later, the wind changed, and it brought something that no structural calculation could have predicted. The storm did not start violently. It started off long. 3 days of constant snow. 4, 5. The weight on the wooden structures became visible. Roofs began to collapse in the village. Lightweight houses, designed for quick heating, were not built to withstand weeks of heat accumulation. Liang watched from the excavated entrance of his semi-subterranean house. The surrounding land absorbed some of the wind's impact. The entrance was protected by the difference in level, but Kang needed firewood, and the firewood was getting lost under the deep snow. On Friday morning, a neighbor knocked on the door. His son had a fever. Their house did not retain heat during the night. It wasn't a proud request, it was short. "Can we stay for a few hours?" Liang did not hesitate. Kang had space. The family settled onto the heated platform. The contrast was immediate. Their bodies relaxed even though the air was still cold. But that created a new problem. More people. Increased oxygen consumption. More need for fire. If he messed up the ventilation control, he could fill the house with smoke. He adjusted the chimney opening with precision. He reduced the heat to the minimum necessary to keep the dough warm. There was the difference again. It wasn't about intensity. It was about duration. The boy's fever went down that night, but the wind did not die down. On the 8th day, another house partially collapsed. The village was beginning to understand something. It wasn't the spreading fire that saved lives. It was the stored warmth. Still, nobody said it out loud. Pride also freezes you, and winter still held one last test, because extreme cold is not just about temperature. It's prolonged time under pressure, and pressure reveals invisible flaws. That morning, Liang woke up to a different sound. It wasn't wind. It was the deep crack of the earth contracting. A fissure had opened up in the upper part of the excavated arch. If it were to give way, tons of soil could collapse. He didn't call for help. He carefully climbed up. He reinforced it with internal wood. He compacted the edges again with frozen earth. He worked in the dark, with Kang still radiating heat behind him. If it failed, there would be no second attempt. But the bow held, and winter finally began to recede. Not abruptly, just 1 degree less per day. Enough. By the time the snow began to melt, the village had already lost homes, but not people, and some began to look at Liang's semi-buried structure with a different expression. Not admiration. Not yet, but silence. Winter doesn't end when the temperature rises. It ends when the reservations run out. Even with the snow beginning to melt, the firewood was running low. The entire village had burned more than expected. The long storm had thrown all the calculations off. Liang Shen was not immune either. The Kang could still store heat for hours, but each fire needed to be more contained. Less wood, more precision. That's when he made a mistake. Small, technical, almost invisible. In an attempt to save fuel, he reduced the chimney opening too much so that the smoke would circulate longer in the tunnels and transfer even more heat to the brick. The logic seemed correct. More time on the channels, more heat absorbed, but the flow became too slow. That night, while the wind was still blowing from the north, the smoke began to return through the inner channels. First, a smell, then the heavy air. The neighbor's family was still there. The boy, recovered from his fever, slept leaning against the warm wall. Liang realized it before the others. The flame was steady, the heat was sufficient, but the air was wrong. He opened the chimney all the way. Nothing has changed. The snow piled up outside had partially blocked the upper exit. The internal pressure had no escape. If it took too long, carbon monoxide would take over the enclosed space. There would be no visible fire. There would be no screaming, just sleep. He woke everyone up. Don't panic. No lengthy explanation needed. He led them out of the cavity, into the brutally cold air. The thermal shock from the outside stung the skin, but it was safe. He went back inside alone. He put out the fire. I measured through the inner tunnels, feeling the residual heat in the brick walls. The blockage was at the top of the outer chimney, frozen by layers of ice and compacted snow. He would have to go up. 40 digs that same morning. Frozen metal, hardwood. It went up slowly. His hands lost feeling within minutes. He broke the accumulated ice with short strokes, conserving energy. Each fragment that fell released a little more invisible flow. When he finished, he went downstairs without rushing. The smoke started coming out clean again, but the fire remained extinguished until dawn. He wouldn't take the risk again that night. It was there that he understood something deeper. Thermal mass does not forgive structural errors. Saving energy is powerful, but controlling the flow is vital. If I had relied solely on efficiency, I could have lost everything. The following morning, he rekindled the fire with a wider opening and fitted a small external barrier to prevent future snow from blocking the exit. Minor correction. A major consequence was avoided. The boy woke up feeling fine, but the village heard what had happened, and for the first time, nobody laughed. Not because the idea was brilliant, but because it almost failed. And surviving a near failure creates a different kind of respect. Still, the cold had not been defeated. He was simply backing away, and when the ice began to melt, it revealed something worse than the snow. Compromised structures, warped houses, wooden bottoms rotting due to accumulated moisture. Spring did not bring immediate comfort. It had consequences, and that's where the biggest proof emerged. When the thaw really began, the water flooded the village. Lightweight houses built on frozen topsoil began to give way as the ground softened. I was leaning against the post. Cracks were appearing in the bases. The extreme cold had only been the first half of the test. The transition was the second one. Liang's semi-buried house had a thermal advantage in winter, but now it was below ground level. If the drainage failed, it could turn into a trap. He had already partially foreseen this. During the original excavation, a slight slope had been created in the interior floor, directing water into a small side channel that drained into lower ground. But I had never tested it under prolonged thawing conditions. On the third afternoon of intense melting, water began to seep through the outer walls, first like moisture, then as visible filaments. The neighbors, whose houses were warping, watched. Some expected it to fail. Perhaps the underground system would work in the cold. But in the water? Liang didn't wait. He dug additional trenches around the entrance. He redirected the flow with shovels and planks. He worked for hours in the cold rain, diverting each current before it built up pressure against the arch. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't pretty, but it was calculation. At night, the interior remained dry. Meanwhile, 2 wooden houses had to be evacuated due to structural risks. That's when something changed irreversibly. One of the men who had mocked him the most at the beginning of winter showed up, not with criticism, with request. Its structure had tilted. The family needed temporary shelter. Liang looked at Kang. He stared into space. He made a simple gesture. They went in. No comment on the past. No mention of the laughter. The brick platform welcomed another family. And there, under the same earthen roof, the silence was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was recognition too late. The harsh winter had passed, but the logical proof remained clear. Homes that relied on a constant power supply failed when the flow ceased. Houses that relied solely on basic physics held up, not by force, but by design. That spring, no one in the village rebuilt exactly as they had the previous year. Some have begun to integrate thermal mass platforms. Others deepened the foundations. Minor changes, not because it's fashionable, from memory. Liang did not become leader. He didn't make any speeches. He continued working. But when the next winter came, fewer homes relied exclusively on air conditioning, and they started storing even more heat. The difference wasn't in the weather. It was in the selection process prior to the weather. The following winter arrived earlier than expected, not as severe as the previous one, but enough to test the village's memory. Some had made minor changes. Others, no. The house of the man who had most mocked Liang the previous year now had a makeshift brick platform, not as efficient, not as well sealed, but it no longer depended solely on heated air. Even so, during the first week of intense cold, something went wrong. The smoke wasn't circulating properly in the newly built channels. The heat was escaping too quickly. On the second night, the cold won out over improvisation. He came to Liang again. This time, not for immediate shelter. He came with a short question. Can you see where we went wrong? It wasn't a proud request. He wasn't humiliated either. It was practical. Liang went there. He assessed the tunnels. The slope was incorrect. The chimney was too low. The airflow was insufficient to maintain stable circulation. He didn't explain much, it just made an adjustment. He raised the outer exit with additional bricks. He reconfigured the inner passage to lengthen the smoke passage. He sealed cracks with a mixture of clay and straw. Simple task. Big difference. When the fire was lit again, the smoke followed the correct path. The heat remained. The man did not apologize, but he stood beside the platform for a few seconds longer than necessary. The recognition didn't come in words. It came during the stay. At that station, no one laughed anymore. Not because Liang was right, but because the cold had decided, and the cold doesn't argue. Over the months, other families began to deepen parts of their homes, not entirely underground, but with thicker walls, firmer foundations. Some people asked for technical details. Others simply watched. The village did not become a perfect model of engineering, but enough has changed. And that was enough. Liang continued waking up early. He continued measuring inclinations with his eyes. He kept adjusting channels before they failed. He wasn't seeking recognition. I was looking for stability. The following winter passed. Then another one. None were as devastating as the first, but everyone tested it, and every time, structures with mass held up better than those that relied solely on air. The lesson was not announced. It was accumulated, like heat stored in a brick. Centuries later, in that same region, modern houses emerged. Lightweight, quick to build, comfortable while the power flowed. The idea of heating the entire air supply seemed like a breakthrough, and in a way it was. But with one unseen condition: ongoing dependence. When the power grid fails in Mohe, what happens today is predictable. In a few hours, the air cools down. In less than a day, the interior becomes uninhabitable. Walls don't store energy. The floor does not accumulate heat. The structure has no reservation. It depends on a constant flow. The old Kang houses and the excavated dwellings, the Yaodong, functioned differently. They weren't looking for the perfect temperature. They were seeking a minimal, sustainable difference. A few meters below the surface, the earth remains stable year-round, between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius, even when the air reaches 40 degrees Celsius. This means that the starting point is already higher. Physics hasn't changed, just the priorities. Today, architects are studying thermal mass again. Underground houses, radiant floor heating systems. They call it innovation, but it already existed. I don't eat luxury goods. As a necessity. The difference is not in advanced technology. It's about understanding energy. Air heats up quickly, but it cools down quickly. The dough heats up slowly, but it holds up. When the system fails, the lightweight house experiences a thermal collapse within hours. The house with dough grants time, and time in extreme cold is life. The winter of the Little Ice Age was not overcome by force. It was traversed by calculation, and this left an invisible trace in the architecture of northern China for centuries, not as a monument, as a silent practice. When the heater stops and the air begins to cool, the question is no longer how much heat you produced. That's all he managed to save. Winter always returns. Sometimes like the weather. Sometimes it's due to a system failure. The ancients did not attempt to tame the cold. They reduced their lead, and while the air disappears quickly, the stone remains. Perhaps the mistake was never technological. Perhaps it was forgetting that surviving isn't about heating everything up. It's warm enough, and keep it.